the group we're going to talk about today, the Rolling Stones. And with me is my co-host and good friend, Derek Shelmerdine. Derek, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing really well. It's great to be back with us, Sam, and what a great band to be talking about.
Yeah, now we're not going to be talking about their whole career because we'll be here for a month talking about it. I was looking at some stats a little earlier, and just one that stuck out for me was over the course of their time, they had 122 singles that they have put out over time coming up to today. There's a lot of stuff we'd have to cover, and neither one of us has that kind of time.
Exactly.
So tell me, what is the era that you chose for us to discuss today?
Well, I thought we'd look at the Brian Jones years because it's really interesting how the Stones came together. Very much Brian Jones's band. So I thought if we focused on that, and it's some of their great music. I mean, there was great music afterwards, but the Brian Jones years really stand in a very different time. I mean, the way the band came together really was interesting. What the guys were doing before they got together. Brian Jones was born in a place called Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, a very pretty little town. And he went to grammar school, played clarinet at school. And then in the late 50s, he was in some local jazz bands. He actually started out more saxophone and then really moved more across to guitar. And in the late 50s, early 1960, he went busking to Scandinavia, which should have been a lot of fun. And then it really started for him around 1961 when he joined a local Cheltenham band called the Ramrods. He was playing guitar at that particular point. And then around the end of 61, 62, he moved to London. He'd already met a guy called Alexis Corner when he was in Cheltenham. And he actually stayed with Alexis in London. And Alexis really gave him his big break into the business. And it's just worth mentioning the one other link at this stage, Brian Jones's very early career. He was in a band called Thunder Odin and the Big Secret, which was actually Paul Pond's band. Now, Paul Pond later changed his name to Paul Jones and became the lead singer with Manfred Mann. Brian Jones was never actually a member of the group, but he stood in from time to time. And it's now early 62 when he formed his first lineup with a guy called Brian Knight, vocals and harmonica, Jeff Bradford, guitar, and Ian Stewart, piano. Now, Ian Stewart will pop up throughout the entire Stones history, well after Brian Jones. And his break really came. He played his first guest spot in the March of 62 for Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated. Now, Alexis Corner was one of the absolute godfathers of British blues, along with John Mayall. So to play with Blues Incorporated was a very, very prestigious affair. So he started off really quite quickly, moving into some pretty serious British blues circles.
Now, at this point, as the Rolling Stones are getting together, were they looking to just be a success in the UK and Europe, or was it always a plan to try and make it everywhere?
Oh, there would be no plan to make it outside of the UK. I mean, if you see the Stones and various Beatles being interviewed around this sort of time, the very early 60s, just after they'd had the first few hit records, they would often ask the question, how long do you think it'll last? And they all say, well, if it lasts 2 or 3 years, we'll be very happy. And in fact, the whole Brian Knight, Jeff Bradford thing gets quite interesting as well, because they actually left Brian Jones's first lineup after a few months and formed a group called Blues by Six. And this is where Charlie Watts comes into the story, not because he joined Brian Jones, but he joined Brian Knight and Jeff Bradford in Blues by Six. He'd been the drummer, the original drummer with Blues Incorporated. And then he left Blues Incorporated to join Blues by Six, which I thought was quite brave at the time. And Ginger Baker of Cream fame, replaced Charlie Watts in Blues Incorporated.
Now, we're at this point, the Rolling Stones aren't really the Rolling Stones. When they first started, were they able to have success as a band right away, or was it something that kind of came along a little into their time? Because I understand their first tour to the U.S. was a complete disaster because they had nothing to really tell the story of who they were, in a sense of there was no single, there was no real hit. Nobody really knew who they were. So, it's just like me forming a band and then going and playing a concert on Friday.
Absolutely. I mean, now we're in the late part of 1961, and the only one in the group that was to become the Rolling Stones is Brian himself, Brian Jones. And what happened? It was in 61 that Mick bumped into Keith on Dartford Railway Station. They'd been in primary school together, lost touch. And apparently Mick was carrying some albums. Keith spotted this, and they both had a great love of the blues. Now, at this time, Mick and Keith were in a band called Little Boy Blue and the Blue Boys with their friend Dick Taylor. Now, Dick Taylor went on to form the Pretty Things, and they even actually made a recording session, Little Boy Blue, and they're recording people like Jimmy Reed and Chuck Berry. I mean, they've always very much been a blues band, blues cover band. And again, Alexis Corner comes into the story again. It was on the 7th of April, 62, that Mick and Keith met Brian and Charlie, because Brian and Charlie Watts, were both playing in Blues Incorporated. Brian Jones at this point was calling himself Elmo Lewis. He got the Elmo after Elmore James, because Dust My Broom is on the record label Elmo James. And Lewis was his first name. His mother actually thought his full name was Lewis Brian Hopkin Jones. So at that time, he decided he'd give himself a stage name. And Paul Pond, the guy became Paul Jones, he excuse me, he was singing with the Blues Incorporated that night as well. And then Mick regularly started singing with Blues Incorporated, and Jack Bruce was involved with them as well. And then basically Brian formed his second lineup, and that's when Mick, Keith and Dick Taylor joined. And Ian Stewart, of course, was still there for the second lineup.
Now, at this point, they're not really playing a lot of rock. It's a lot of blues influenced music at this point. When did the Mick, Keith, and Brian decide that they wanted to become rock performers as opposed to doing more blues? And I know at this point they're not together, but how did that come about?
Well, what happened? They very much stayed a blues band for a long time. I mean, they played their first gig as the Rolling No G Stones on the 12th of July, 62 at a famous London club called the Marquee. Ian Stewart was still in the band at this point. He's still playing piano, and Dick Taylor left shortly after this particular gig. And what's interesting is, when I was researching the book and I was researching this particular story, it was fascinating. When I went to the Rolling Stones website, the recollection on their website was that Mick Avery, the guy that became the Kinks drummer, played drums that night for their first gig as the Rolling Stones. But I found a website called Cast Off Kinks, which was a tribute band made up of people who'd actually been in the Kinks. So people like the Davis brothers have both played in it. And he said in an interview that he rehearsed with the Rolling Stones once, but he never actually played with them. And it's more likely a guy called Tony Chapman was the drummer. The Stones, before Charlie Watts, had a steady flow of drummers through the lineup. He came from a band called the Cliftons. And interestingly enough, when Bill Wyman comes into the story, he comes from that same group, the Cliftons, and they're still heavily into the blues. In fact, the name Rolling Stone comes from Muddy Waters' song. It was the second song ever released on the Chess Records label called Muddy Waters, and they went into the studios in the October of '62 and recorded half a dozen songs. People like Muddy Waters and Bo Diddley. So they were very, very much a blues R&B focused group. And to put that into context, 22nd of October 62, that recording session, the Beatles had just gone into the UK charts with their first hit single a couple of weeks earlier, Love Me Do. So they're a good 6 or 8 months behind where the Beatles were.
With the Rolling Stones, as you said, no G, starting to work on their band and get their feet under them. At what point do they decide that they're going to concentrate on this lineup? And when did they decide to start looking for record labels and that sort of thing? Or did a label exec happen to find them?
No, I mean, what they tried to do with that recording session I just mentioned was they hawked that around the record companies and nobody was interested. In fact, Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts have still got to join. I mean, Bill Wyman had been in a skiffle group in 57. He auditioned for the Stones at the end of 62. And Charlie Watts joined in the February of 62 from Blues Incorporated. And it's interesting that when Charlie Watts joined the Stones, he still had a permanent day job. He was still working as a graphic designer, and it was only then that he decided to join them. So now we're in the beginning of 1963, and the Stones lineup is now in place. I mean, there's still it's actually not the five of them. There's the classic five plus the pianist Ian Stewart. Yeah, he's still with them.
So at this point, are they starting to tour a little bit and get to playing live shows and getting a following in the UK?
Yeah, not so much touring. The bands tended to remain very local. Like, the Liverpool, the Beatles were very much big around the Liverpool scene. The Stones were very much big around the London scene. The Animals were very much big around the sort of north of England, northeastern Newcastle.
So it was basically play your neighborhood type deal.
Oh, very much. I mean, that's how UK the music scene was in the very early 60s. But we're now at a critical point in the Stones story. They played their first gig at another famous blues R&B club in London, the Crawdaddy Club, in February of 63. Now, what's interesting, a guy called Giorgio Gomelski owned the Crawdaddy, and he managed the Stones at that particular time. But he made the big mistake of not having a contract saying that he managed them. And in the April of 63, a guy called Andrew Loog Oldham comes into the picture. Now, this is when the Stones' fortune changes absolutely, completely. This is the sort of Brian Epstein moment. He saw them at the Crawdaddy, and he signed them up shortly afterwards. He didn't have any contractual problems because Giorgio Gomelski hadn't got a contract. And what's interesting is that, like Brian Epstein molded the Beatles into a particular image, Andrew Oldham had very much an image in mind for the Rolling Stones. Like the Beatles, and this is where the whole songwriting thing changes and the whole move from R&B covers changes. He could see how successful the Beatles were being with the writing team of Lennon McCartney. So he was very keen for them to write. But unlike the Beatles, it's quite the opposite. Brian Epstein turned them from, leather-clad to smart Italian suits. Andrew Oldham went the other way. He decided to go with an image of, would you want your daughter going out with a Rolling Stone? A sort of bad boy image. He also moved the focus from Brian to Mick Jagger, the front man. And he moved. He decided that Ian Stewart didn't have the right image for the Rolling Stones. He'd been playing piano, so he moved him off the stage. But he stayed with the band as the road manager. And if you check the writing credits on an awful lot of Rolling Stone material, he still plays on the recordings and reputedly occasionally played in the wings at live gigs, which must have been a bit weird.
So at this point, who were the two primary writers for the Rolling Stones?
Sorry, Sam, I missed that.
Who were the primary writers for the Rolling Stones at this point? Was it Mick Jagger and Brian Jones, or was it Jagger and Richard, or was it a combination thereof? Or
it was very much Jagger and Richards. None of the others really did any writing. I mean, Bill Wyman wrote the odd song here and there, but it was very, very much Jagger Richards from there on in. I mean, this is where they had... Sorry.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this is when they had their first hit record. It was Andrew Oldham that got them a record deal with Decca. And they had their first hit with Come On in the UK, a Chuck Berry cover, in the July of 63. I just mentioned at this stage, this comes really quite important later, was that when I say that Andrew Oldham got the Rolling Stones a record deal with Decca, he did and he didn't. What he did, he signed his own production company. Impact Sound was the organization that actually had the recording deal with Decca, and Impact Sound owned the master tapes, and the Rolling Stones didn't actually have the copyright on their own material for a long time to come, but we'll get more into that.
So at this point, they finally have a couple songs coming out, and I noticed when doing my research on picking the music, I noticed that the Rolling Stones did the mandatory homage to the Beatles, covering "I Want to Be Your Man." Was that basically for them to be noticed by doing a song by a band so loved in the UK at that time?
It probably was. I mean, it's a really interesting situation that I Want to Be Your Man was the Stones' second single in the UK. And when it was put out in America, I Want to Be Your Man was put out very, very briefly with a B-side called Stoned. In the UK, the B-side was originally called Stones. And then if you look at various record labels with later publications of that single, it's called variously Stones and Stoned. But in America, this is about February 64, it was withdrawn almost immediately. Various copies did get out, and it's now worth it's well collectible. Check your attic if you have a copy of "I Want to Be Your Man" and Stoned on the London label. It's probably worth quite a nice little meal. And it's worth just mentioning that as well, the Stones is variously attributed to the writing credit for Nanka Felge or Felge, and that's the name that the Stones use. You'll see it on a few of their songs when the whole band contributes to the writing. So if it's not Jagger Richard, if you see Felge, it's basically all of the Stones. But what's interesting was that the second single, Not Fade Away, had the I Want to Be Your Man as the B-side. That was the second single, Not Fade Away, because in America, their first hit, interestingly enough, with a Jagger Richard composition, a song called Tell Me, which was taken off their first Rolling Stones album. So it's interesting. A lot of people were having hits with the Beatles songs at that time, a lot of Liverpool groups. So I guess the Stones thought that they would probably accelerate their success if they picked a Stones song.
So, as you mentioned, the image of the Beatles went from leather to suits. The Stones went from suits to leather, bad boy image. Was something that they readily accepted, or was there any pushback to how they wanted to be portrayed?
No, that was very much what they wanted, I think. Interesting enough, by the time we get into the early Stones, early Beatles in the UK, around sort of 63, 64, you know, 14-year-olds would ask each other, are you a Beatles fan or a Stones fan? And people tended to be in one camp or the other. I was in the Stones camp personally. I quite liked the sort of American R&B blues material that was being covered at that time.
For me, it was the Beatles. I have to say, because I hadn't heard a whole lot of Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
Because at the time that I caught the Beatles were the thing, the Rolling Stones were not. Yeah. So as I mentioned in the Beatles episodes that we did, the Beatles were played a lot on the jukebox at my mom's restaurant. So that was I heard the Beatles. I didn't really hear the Rolling Stones. I didn't hear the Rolling Stones until the 70s. That's when I catch the Rolling Stones. So the stuff that I picked for this show, such as The Last Time, and there was another one that I had considered for the show, but I didn't put on, Get Off My Cloud. Those ones, as examples, were songs that I didn't catch until late 70s, early 80s. So I didn't really get the indoctrination to the Rolling Stones that I did with the Beatles. So I knew Love Me Do, Please Please, Please Please Me, I Want to Hold Your Hand, Help, all those songs. I knew all those songs. The Rolling Stones, I only knew a couple, and I guess that didn't help the Rolling Stones over here in America at that time.
No, absolutely. I mean, what's interesting, they were very different times. In the UK, the whole beat group thing had really been picking up a head of steam from the end of 62. 63 was the year it really all exploded. And of course, those British bands didn't arrive in America till the British invasion, after the Beatles appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show on the 9th of February, 64. That was pretty much when the British bands were starting to come across. But interestingly enough, they had their first hit with an American back in November 63. Excuse me. They just recorded a song called My Only Girl, and they were on a TV show called Thank You Lucky Stars in the UK with Gene Pitney, and he heard the song. They sort of played a version to him, and he really liked it. He liked the lyrics, but changed the melody. So renamed the song to That Girl Belongs to Yesterday, and it gave Jagger Richard their first hit. It was number 7 for Gene Pitney in the UK. It missed out on the Billboard Top 40, but it was a hit in Canada. It got to 41 in Canada. So their career is really starting to move. But as you say, in their first tour in America in the June of 64. I mean, that's the very, very beginning of the British invasion. The British bands weren't really, as you quite rightly say, not very well known at that point. And it was the August of 64 when Tell Me was their first top 40 hit.
And you are listening to A Chat With, sponsored by Garage Oil Spirits. And my guest is the author of Rock'n'Roll Unravelled, Derek Shelmerdine. And today we're talking about the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones era, which I believe is 62 to 69.
69,
now,
yeah.
At this point, we're in 1964. I played Satisfaction for the break, which is actually from 1965. It actually came out in June of that year, and we'll get to it in a moment. But at this point in 64, 65, what is the perception of the Rolling Stones, both in UK and here in in North America?
Well, I think in North America they were a relatively unknown band. They just had a couple of hit records. In the UK, they were absolutely, and Europe, they were absolutely enormous. And it's worth just mentioning while we're in '64 that the last time you played early, one of the great early hits, that was a number one for them in the UK. But the song itself, Andrew Loog Oldham, the guy that was their manager, he recorded an album with what he called the Andrew Oldham Orchestra of Rolling Stones songs. It was called something like Songbook. And one of those songs on the Andrew Oldham Orchestra version was The Last Time. And 30 years later, it all came back to, well, not so much bite them, a bit of a windfall of money. What happened? Alan Klein, who'll come into the story very shortly, the manager, well known for involvement with the Beatles, he sued the Verve for a song called Bittersweet Symphony. They had an agreement to sample the Andrew Oldham Orchestra version of The Last Time, but Alan Klein argued that they'd sort of overdone it, as they were, and he insisted they would draw the album, Urban Hymns, and it was actually sorted out when the songwriting credit on the Verve album went to Jagger Richard, and it wasn't until 2019 that reverted back to its original Richard Ashcroft writing credit.
So at this point, Jagger and Richards, as a writing team, were starting to write songs that were starting to catch on with fans in the UK and in North America. Maybe not number one hits similar to McCartney and Lennon, but they were writing songs that were resonating with the UK and the US crowd. How was the perception of the band changing at this point?
Well, I mean, that was a good choice with Satisfaction. That was a landmark for them, particularly in America. It gave them their first American number one. I must just say, Satisfaction, they were on tour in the UK at that time. And on the 1st of October 1965, I was at the theatre in Chester, in the north of England, in a Rolling Stones concert, and it was unbelievable. It was a package tour where you had about 6 or 7 bands, artists, and they each literally played for 10 or 15 minutes each. And as soon as the Rolling Stones came on, this would be a 2,500 seater kind of theatre, cinema theatre. And when the Stones came on, every young girl in the audience stood up and screamed a little heart out for the entire time the Stones were on stage. That was one of life's memorable evenings.
So they're starting to get a following.
Yeah.
At this point, did they decide to expand their horizons a little bit and move a little further into the UK with their shows and get into Europe a little more?
Oh, absolutely. They toured like the Beatles. They toured Europe quite extensively. Germany has always been a very big market for British rock and roll. And this is now around the 65s when Alan Klein comes into the scene. Andrew Oldham appointed him as business manager. And interesting, he didn't tell the Stones. I mean, Andrew Oldham never told the Stones about the fact that he had signed himself, his production company, to Decca rather than the Stones. And he never told the Stones that Alan Klein would be becoming their business manager. And he stayed with them through to 1970. And one of the reasons that, Mick Jagger and others were suing Alan Klein for decades afterwards was that because, well, what happened was that when Keith and Mick were caught up in a drugs bust, Andrew Oldham went over to America and left Alan Klein to sort it out, and it meant that all of the back catalogue, when Andrew Oldham came back from America towards the end of that year, 1967, he sold his whole stake in the Stones to Alan Klein. So Alan Klein's ABCO became the owner of the Stones back catalogue. So pretty much everything the Stones recorded up to 1970 and slightly beyond was the property of Alan Klein. So there was much lawsuits flying after that. And it's interesting, really. 1966 is when it really started to change. I was saying earlier that that Stones didn't seem to have as much exposure in America. Certainly nothing like their fame in the UK. And it's not surprising because the Stones did their last American tour in the summer of 1966. So that was the last time that Brian Jones actually toured. It was only when they came back in 1969 that was the next time they set foot on American soil. And they didn't actually tour the UK either after 1966. It's interesting. It's the same time that the Beatles stopped touring, but for different reasons, I think.
So at this point, are the Rolling Stones starting to get media coverage from various television shows and media outlets at this point, or was it still recording and concerts that was getting them over?
No, they were doing an awful lot of TV, and they would be getting a lot of coverage in the press. In fact, there's one great example back from 1964. They took an ad out in the NME, the New Musical Express, a sort of forerun of a music paper in the UK. And by 1964, people like the Beatles and the Stones and other young men were all growing their hair long. And they literally took out an advert in the NME that said, and this is over the Christmas of 1964, "Happy Christmas to the starving hairdressers and their families," which I thought was really rather nice.
That is, and kind of cheeky too.
Absolutely, it showed the humor.
That was definitely tongue in cheek, but
yeah.
It's nice that they acknowledge the fact that they've started a fad. Now, I want to get into 1965 a little bit.
Okay.
Because that seems to be a nice little opening point for them, success-wise, where they're starting to show a little bit of success. They released Satisfaction in June, Get Off of My Cloud as an example in September of 65 as well. And The Last Time was out in February of 65. So that was just three examples of songs that were successful for the band. And is it at this point that they kind of reached, not their peak, so to speak, but they reached a pinnacle where things were on a steady climb at this point?
Oh, I think so. They've had 2 or 3 albums out by this point, and in 1965, Out of Our Heads, which was released in America as December's Children, still a lot of covers. They're still doing an awful lot of covers at this time. Like the Beatles, it was really the second half of the 60s where they started writing their own material a lot more. Aftermath was the first album of all. Well, the UK version was the first album of all Rolling Stones originals. So
at this point, they're starting to get their feet under them. Was the silliness that was going on behind the scenes affecting them in any way, or was it they were able to focus on the music at the time and focus on what needed to be focused on, as opposed to the lawsuits and the stupidity that was happening off of a public eye?
Yeah, very much. They were starting to have, Mick Jagger certainly was starting to have misgivings about Alan Klein. while he was still there, towards the second half of the 70s. In fact, in the late 60s, when John Lennon got involved, 69, with Alan Klein, Mick Jagger actually warned him that he wants to be very, very careful. So given that Mick was starting to get a few misgivings the way they were being managed and how Alan Klein was becoming, very much central to everything they were doing, particularly the finances. But they didn't have anything of the kind of infight. Well, there was no real infighting going on in the Stones like there was with the Beatles.
Now, the band is doing fairly well. And but all is not really well with the Beatles at this point because Brian Jones was kind of pushing himself to the forefront a little bit, and he felt he was the leader of the band. How did the band feel about that at that time?
Well, there was a little bit of friction with Brian because Brian was. They were all doing drugs, but Brian was certainly more into it than the others, and the fact that in the October of '67, there was Brian was bust, and he actually pleaded guilty to the charge. He's got probation and a fine. He didn't actually go to prison, but it did cause him major problems. And this is really the beginning of the end for the band because he now couldn't get a visa to get to America, and that's very much where they felt that the real books were. And it was interesting because, that was the October of 67. In the February of 67, Mick and Keith had their own drugs bust. And that's sort of dragged on through into the summer. They were charged with drug possession. They were actually found guilty, appealed, and it was overturned. So gets us to the July. So they don't have any kind of criminal record as Brian did, and there was certainly that led to a bit of friction there. But there's an interesting aspect to that Mick and Keith bust. Around the August, they wrote a song called "We Love You," and it was based on their prison experiences. It was a little bit of a ditty about the experiences in prison. But it was interesting when they recorded "We Love You," John Lennon, Paul McCartney, showing solidarity, sang backing vocals on "We Love You," and at the time they were going through the trials, the Who. Rush released a single of The Last Time and Under My Thumb, two Jack and Richard compositions, again to show solidarity with the band. Peter Entwistle actually missed those recordings. He was away on honeymoon, I seem to recall. But what was interesting was that the B-side to We Love You was Dandelion. And, that coupling was released on both sides of the Atlantic. But in the UK, it was the We Love You side that was the hit. And in America, it was the Dandelion side that was the hit. And that also was another landmark in the fact that, up till then, Andrew Oldham or his Impact Sound production company had pretty much produced all their recordings to date. And that was the end of that. So, you can see that things were really starting to change now. In 1967, you could see really the writing was on the wall for Brian.
Yeah, and one of the things that I noticed was around this time, there was Jones's girlfriend at the time, Anita Pallenberg.
Yeah,
she left Brian Jones for Keith Richards.
Yeah,
because of the violence that Jones was showing towards her. Especially on a vacation that they had gone on together. This had to really kind of fracture the Rolling Stones a little bit as at that time. And was that a major lead up to Brian leaving the band before he tragically passed away?
Yeah, I think that was another nail in the coffin, as it were. There were quite a few things sort of bubbling around underneath like that. That were really causing rifts in the band. They stopped touring in the UK. They couldn't tour in America. They were still in lots of hit records and positive vibes. But it was 1967, of course, with Satanic Majesty's Request album, again, both sides of the Atlantic. And that was the first album that really brought them negative feedback from the album. A lot of people really didn't rate that. It was the Stones' sort of excursion into psychedelia. And a lot of people didn't think it worked.
So at this point, the band is kind of fractured. There's infighting, that sort of thing. And Brian Jones is kind of moving off on his own, even though he was an integral part of the band at this point still.
Yeah.
And the others, they formed a little clique of their own. And they maintained that he, at times, could be very cruel to them.
Yeah.
And kind of rude. And that had to be wearing on them as well. And also, it turns out that he was getting a little more money than what was thought that he was receiving at this point, because he was, quote, as I said earlier, the leader in his eyes. How much of a factor did that have in it? It was only £5, but still, £5 adds up after a while. And I'm just wondering, like, what was the last straw?
Well, I think you're right. The amount of money wasn't large, but it was significant symbolically, as it were. I mean, it was Brian Jones who started the group. There's no two ways about that. It was Andrew Oldham that very much changed the focus in Mick Jagger's direction. And Brian was never particularly happy about that. And Brian was also not as happy about the fact that they were writing their own material. He was very, very much a blues enthusiast, and he felt that they should be, staying closer to their blues roots than they did. And I think that probably, as the years are going on, and certainly by the time we get to 67, 68, most of the material they're releasing is Jagger Richards. So it's moving further and further away from where Brian wanted to be. So, it's becoming inevitable on a number of levels that, there's going to be a parting of the ways in the not too distant future. And in fact, in the June of 67, interestingly enough, he played sax on a Beatles recording, You Know My Name, which ended up as the B-side to Let It Be. So, he actually did his own thing from time to time.
He still seems to be having a lot of trouble with the drugs and drinking and the law in general. Did that have a major factor on him leaving? Not in the sense, because there's lots of bands that have people that have drug problems and drinking problems and even problems with the law, and they're able to get around it and it still works. But in this case, it doesn't seem to be working. And as we get to the end of his tenure with the Rolling Stones, and we've got about 5 minutes left, by the way.
Right.
It was found out that they were going to do a tour in 1969.
That's right.
Of North America, and Jones couldn't get a work permit to go on the tour. Was that it? Was that the bottom line? They just said, that's it. We have to draw it there, or was there something earlier?
No, I think there've been bits and pieces earlier, but certainly the fact that they had this opportunity for the '69 tour and they couldn't go because of Brian. So I mean, basically they sacked Brian. He'd recently bought his Coachemel farm, and none of the band actually went and saw him, but he was told that he was fired. He did actually apparently approach Alexis Corner, who was forming a new band, if he could join him, which would have been an absolute complete full circle. But Alexis apparently said, I think you ought you ought to form your own band, Brian. I think he's a bit concerned that Brian, as an ex-Rolling Stone, would be a little bit of a focus. But the last live performance he ever did was on a TV special that never got aired, called Rock'n'Roll Circus, before a live studio audience. And it never got aired because the Who were on that. They played a version of A Quick One While He's Away. And apparently Mick Jagger felt that the Who had so upstaged them that he refused to let it be shown. And it wasn't until 1996 that it was released on a DVD. And, of course, Brian sadly died on the 3rd of July, 1969, found dead in a swimming pool. And it's worth just noting that, there's always been mystery. It's always been a bit of a cloud in mystery, his death. And, in fact, in 2009, there's a national newspaper called the Daily Mail in the UK, and they ran an article to say that the police were reviewing Jones's death because new evidence had arrived. I never saw anything again after that. But it just shows that, some people did. A guy, one of the roadies, I think, wrote a book called Who Killed Cock Robin, and he claims that Brian Jones was murdered. There's a lot of contradiction around how he died.
And with that, we'll put a pause to that subject, and we're going to play one of the last tracks that he was featured on that became a hit, and that was Ruby Tuesday. That'll be coming up in just a moment. But just before we do that, I do want to thank you for coming on today again. It's fun having you on. And you picked this subject, which is a very good subject. A subject I'm interested in for our next show. And I'm just wondering your take on it. Why don't we take a look at Chess Records?
Oh, absolutely.
And some of the artists that were on there, Muddy Waters,
oh, absolutely,
Chuck Berry, just as a couple of examples.
Yeah.
And we'll take a look at them, and that'll be coming up in a few weeks. But we had a lot of success with the Beatles 3-part series, and it is all thanks to you and the good work that you do. The name of the book is Rock'n'Roll Unravelled. The author is Derek Shelmerdine. And I want to thank you all for listening. And Derek, I look forward to catching up with you again very, very soon. And I hope that you have a great time in the meantime. And I encourage you all to check out the Rolling Stones catalog. There's a lot of great music. You may not know some of it, and it's worth listening to.
Absolutely. Been a blast, mate.
And with that, we're going to play Ruby Tuesday from January 1967. You are listening to A Chat With. I'm your host, Sam MacBeath. Want to thank the good people at Garage Oil Spirits. And don't forget, coming up in April, Derek and I will be asking for your votes as we vie for the International Radio Show of the Year with the International Singer-Songwriters Association. So be sure and get those fingers ready. In the meantime, take care, be good, love you all. Bye-bye.